Walk Two Moons, Set 5, Chapters 15 through 19. A snake has a snack. It was hotter than blazes in South Dakota. In Sioux Falls, Gramps took off his shirt. Passing Mitchell, Graham unbuttoned her dress down to her waist. Just beyond Chamberlain, Gramps took a detour to the Missouri River. He parked the car beneath a tree overlooking a sandy bank. Graham and Gramps kicked off their shoes. It was quiet and hot, hot, hot. All you could hear was a crow calling somewhere upriver and the distant sound of cars along the highway. The hot air pressed against my face, and my hair was like a hot, heavy blanket draped on my neck and back. It was so hot you could smell the heat baking the stones and dirt along the bank. Graham pulled her dress up over her head, and Gramps undid his buckle and let his pants slide to the ground. They started kicking water at each other and scooping it up and letting it run down their faces. They walked into where it was knee deep and sat down. "Come on, Chickabiddy," Gramps called. Graham said, "It's delicious." I gazed up and down the river, not a soul in sight. The water looked cool and clear. Graham and Gramps sat there in the river, grinning away. I waded in and I sat down. It was nearly heaven, with that cool water rippling and a high, clear sky all around us, and trees waving along the banks. My hair floated all around me. My mother's hair had been long and black like mine, but a week before she left, she cut it off. My father said to me, "Don't cut your hair, Sal. Please don't cut yours." My mother said, "I knew you wouldn't like it if I cut mine." My father said, "I didn't say anything about yours." "But I know what you're thinking," she said. "I loved your hair, Sugar," he said. I saved her hair. I swept it up from the kitchen floor and I wrapped it in a plastic bag and I hid it beneath the floorboards of my room. It was still there, along with the postcards that she sent. As Grandma Gramps and I sat in the Missouri River, I tried not to think of the postcards. I tried to concentrate on the high sky and the cool water. It would have been perfect, except for that ornery crow calling away, "Car, car, car." "Will we be there here long?" I asked. The boy came out of nowhere. Grant saw him first and whispered, "Get behind me, Chickabiddy." "You too," he said to Grant. The boy was about 15 or 16 with shaggy dark hair. He wore blue jeans and no shirt. His chest was brown and muscular. In his hand he held a long bowie knife, its sheath fastened to his belt. He stood next to Gramps' pants on the bank. I thought of Phoebe and knew that if she were here, she would be warning us that the boy was a lunatic who would hack us all to pieces. I was wishing we had never stopped at the river, and that my grandparents would be more cautious, maybe even a little more like Phoebe, who saw danger everywhere. As the boy stared at us, Gramps said, "Howdy." The boy said, "This here's private property." Gramps looked all around. "Is it? I didn't see any signs." "It's private property." "Why, heck," Gramps said, "this here's a river. I never heard of no river being private property." The boy picked up Gramps' pants and slid his hand into a pocket. "This land where I'm standing is private property." I was frightened of the boy, and I wanted Gramps to do something, but Gramps looked cool and calm. He sounded as if he hadn't a care in the world, but I knew that he was worried by the way he kept inching in front of me and Graham. I felt around the riverbed, pulled up a flat stone, and I skimmed it across the water. The boy watched the stone, counting the skips. A snake flicked along the bank and slid into the water. "See that tree?" Gramps said. He pointed to an old willow leaning into the water near where the boy stood. "I see it," the boy said, sliding his hand into another of Gramps' pockets. Gramps said, "See that knothole? What's what this here chickabiddy can do to a knothole?" Gramps winked at me. The veins in his neck were standing out. You could practically see the blood rushing through them. I fed around the riverbed and I pulled up another flat, jagged rock. I had done this a million times in the swimming hole in Bybanks. I pulled my arm back and I tossed that rock straight at the tree. One edge embedded itself in the knothole. The boy stopped rummaging through Gramps' pockets and eyed me. Gramps said, "Oh!" and flailed at the water. She reached down, pulled up a snake, and gave Gramps a puzzled look. "It's a water moccasin, isn't it?" she said. "It's a poisonous one, isn't it?" The snake slithered and wriggled, straining toward the water. "I do believe it has had a snack out of my leg." She stared hard at Gramps. The boy stood on the bank holding Gramps' wallet. Gramps scooped up Gram and carried her out of the water. "Would you mind dropping that thing?" he said to Gram, who was still clutching the snake. To me, he said, "Get on out of here, chickabiddy." As Gramps put Gram on the riverbank, the boy came and knelt beside her. "I'm so glad you have that knife," Gram said, reaching for it. As he made a slit in Gram's leg across the snake bite, blood trickled down her ankle. I grabbed Gram's hand as she stared up at the sky. Gramps knelt to suck out the wound, but the boy said, "Here, I'll do it." The boy placed his mouth against Gram's bloody leg. He sucked and spit and sucked and spit, and Gram's eyelids flooded. "Can you point us to a hospital?" Gramps said. The boy nodded as he spit. Gramps and the boy carried Gram to the car and settled her in the back seat while I snatched the clothes from the riverbank. We placed Gram's head on my lap and her feet on the boy's lap, and all the while the boy continued sucking and spitting. In between, he gave directions to the hospital. Gram held on to my hand. Gramps, still in his boxer shorts and dripping wet, carried Gram into the hospital. The boy's mouth hovered over her leg the whole time, sucking and spitting. Gram spent the night in the hospital. In the waiting room, the boy from the riverbank sprawled in a chair. I offered him a paper towel. "You've got blood on your mouth," I said. I handed him a $50 bill. "My grandfather said to give you this. That's all the cash he has right now. He said to tell you thanks. He'd come out himself, but he doesn't want to leave her." He looked at the $50 bill in my hand. "I don't need it." "You don't have to stay," I said. He glanced around the waiting room. "I know it." He looked away and then said, "I like your hair. I was thinking of cutting it." "Don't." I sat down beside him. He said, "It really wasn't private property." I didn't think so. Later, when I went in to see Gram, she was all tucked up in bed, pale and sleepy. Next to her on the narrow bed, Gramps was lying on top of the covers, stroking her hair. A nurse came in and made him get off the bed. He had by now put his pants on, but he looked a wreck. I asked Gram how she was feeling. She blinked her eyes a few times and said, "Piddles." Gramps said, "They must have given her something. She doesn't know what she's saying." I leaned down and whispered in her ear, "Gram, don't leave us." "Piddles," Gramps said. When the nurse left the room, Gramps climbed back on top of the bed and lay down next to Gram. He patted the bed. "Well," he said, "this ain't our marriage bed, but it will do." The singing tree. Gram was released from the hospital the next morning, mainly because she was so ornery. Gramps wanted her to stay another day, but Gram climbed out of the bed and said, "Where's my underwear?" "I guess this cantankerous woman is getting out of here," Gramps said. I think her fear had made us all a little cantankerous. I had spent the night in the waiting room. Gramps offered to get me a motel room, but I was afraid that if I left the hospital, I'd never see Gram again. The boy we had met at the river curled up in the armchair, but I don't think he slept either. Once he used the telephone, I heard him say, "Yeah, I'll be home in the morning. I'm with some friends." The boy woke up at 6 o'clock and said Gram was much better. He handed me a piece of paper. "It's my address, in case you ever want to write or anything, but I understand if you didn't." Open the paper. "What's your name?" He smiled. "Oh yeah, right." He took the paper and added his name, Tom Fleet. "See ya," he said. As we were checking out of the hospital, I asked if we could call my father, and Gramps said, "Well, now, Chickabiddy, I thought about that, but it's only going to make him worry. Do you think that we could wait to call him when we get to Idaho?" Gramps was right, but I was disappointed. I was ready to call my father. I wanted very much to hear his voice, but I was also afraid that I might ask him to come and get me. Outside the hospital, I heard the warbling of a bird, and it was such a familiar warble that I stopped and listened for its source. Bordering the parking lot was a rim of poplars. The sound was coming from somewhere in the top of one of those trees, and I thought instantly of the singing tree in Five Banks. Next to my favorite sugar maple tree beside the barn is a tall aspen. When I was younger, I heard the most beautiful bird song coming from the top of that tree. It was not a call, it was a true bird song. The trills and warbles. I stood beneath that tree for the longest time, hoping to catch sight of the bird who was singing such a song. I saw no bird, only leaves waving in the breeze. The longer I stared up at the leaves, the more it seemed that it was the tree itself that was singing. Every time I passed that tree, I listened. Sometimes it sang, sometimes it did not, but from then on I always called it the singing tree. The morning after my father learned that my mother was not coming back, he left for Lewiston, Idaho. Gram and Gramps came to stay with me. I had pleaded to go along, but my father said he didn't think that I should have to go through that. That day I climbed up into the maple and I watched the singing tree, waiting for it to sing. I stayed there all day and on into the early evening. It did not sing. At dusk, Gramps placed 3 sleeping bags at the foot of the tree, and Gram and I, slept there all night. The tree did not sing. In the hospital parking lot, Gram heard the song too. "Oh, Salamanca," she said. "A singing tree." She pulled at Gramps' sleeve. "Oh, it's a good sign, don't you think?" As we swept on across South Dakota toward the Badlands, the whispers no longer said, "Hurry, hurry, 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 hurry," or "Rush, rush." They now said, "Slow down, slow down." I could not figure this out. It seemed some sort of warning, but I did not have too much time to think about it, as I was busy telling about Phoebe. In the course of a lifetime, a few days after Phoebe and I had seen Mr. Bookway and Mrs. Cadaver whacking away at the rhododendron, I walked home with Phoebe after school. She was as crotchety and sullen as a 3-legged mule, and I was not quite sure why. She had been asking me why I had not said anything to my father about Mrs. Cadaver and Mr. Bookway, and I told her that I was waiting for the right time. "Your father was over there yesterday," Phoebe said. "I saw him. He'd better watch out. What would you do if Mrs. Cadaver chopped up your father? Would you live with your mother?" It surprised me when she said that. It reminded me that I had not told Phoebe nothing about my mother. Yes, I suppose I would go live with her. That was impossible, and I knew it. But for some reason, I could not tell Phoebe that, so I lied. Phoebe's mother was sitting at the kitchen table when we walked in. In front of her was a pan of burned brownies, and she blew her nose. "Oh, sweetie," she said, "you startled me. How was it?" "How was what?" Phoebe said. "Why, sweetie, school, of course. How was it? How were your classes?" "Okay." "Just okay?" Mrs. Winterbottom suddenly leaned over and kissed Phoebe's cheek. "I'm not a baby, you know," Phoebe said, wiping off the kiss. Mrs. Winterbottom stabbed the brownies with a knife. "Want one?" she said. "They're burned," Phoebe said. "Besides, I'm too fat." "Oh, sweetie, you're not fat," Mrs. Winterbottom said. "I am." "No, you're not." "I am, I am, I am!" Phoebe shouted at her mother. "You don't have to bake things for me. I'm too fat, and you don't have to wait here for me to come home. I'm 13 now." Phoebe marched upstairs. Mrs. Winterbottom offered me a brownie, so I sat down at the table. What I started doing was remembering the day before my mother left. I did not know it was to be her last day home. Several times that day, my mother asked me if I wanted to walk up in the fields with her. It was drizzling outside, and I was cleaning out my desk, and I just did not feel like going. Maybe later, I kept saying. When she asked me for about the 10th time, I said, "No, I don't want to go. Why do you keep asking me?" I don't know why I did that. I didn't mean anything by it. But that was one of the last memories that she had of me. I wish I could take it back. Phoebe's sister Prudence stormed into the house, slamming the door behind her. "I blew it! I just know it!" she wailed. "Oh, sweetie," her mother said. "I did," Prudence said. I did. Mrs. Winterbottom half-heartedly chipped away at the brownies and asked Prudence if she would have another chance at cheerleading tryouts. "Yes, tomorrow, but I know I'm going to blow it," her mother said. "Maybe I'll along and watch." I could tell that Mrs. Winterbottom was trying to rise above some awful sadness she was feeling, but Prudence couldn't see that. Prudence had her own agenda, just as I had my own and agenda that day that my mother wanted me to walk with her. I couldn't see my own mother's sadness. "What?" Prudence said. "Come along and watch?" "Yes, wouldn't that be nice?" "No," Prudence said. "No, no, no. You can't. It would be awful." I heard the front door open and shut, and Phoebe came in the kitchen waving a white envelope. "Guess what was on the steps?" she said. Mrs. Winterbottom took the envelope and turned it over and over before she slowly unsealed it and slipped out the message. "Oh," she said, "who is doing this?" She held out the piece of paper. "In the course of a lifetime, what does it matter?" Prudence said, "Well, I have more important things to worry about, I can assure you. I know I'm going to blow those cheerleading tryouts. I just know it." On and on she went until Phoebe said, "Cripes, Prudence, in the course of a lifetime, what does it matter?" At that moment, it was as if a switch went off in Mrs. Winterbottom's brain. She put her hand to her mouth and stared out the window. She was invisible to Prudence and Phoebe, though. They did not notice. Phoebe said, "Are these cheerleading tryouts such a big deal? Will you even remember them in 5 years?" "Yes," Prudence said. "Yes, I most certainly will." "How about 10 years? Will you remember them in 10?" "Yes," Prudence said. As I walked home, I thought about the message. In the course of a lifetime, what does it matter? I said it over and over, and I wondered about the mysterious messenger, and I wondered about all the things in the course of a lifetime that would not matter. And I did not think cheerleading tryouts would matter, but I was not sure about yelling at your mother. I was certain, however, that if your mother left, it would be something that mattered in the whole long course of your lifetime. The good man. I should mention my father. When I was telling Phoebe's story to Graham and Gramps, I did not say much about my father. He was their son, and not only did they know him better than I, but as Graham often said, he was the light of their lives. They had three other sons at one time, but one son died when a tractor flipped over on him. One was killed when he skied into a tree, and the third died when he jumped into the freezing cold Ohio River to save his best friend. The best friend survived, but no, my uncle did not. My father was the only son left, but even if the other sons were still alive, my father might still be their light, because he is also a kind, honest, simple, and good man. I do not mean simple as in simple-minded. I mean that he likes plain and simple things. His favorite clothes are the flannel shirts and blue jeans that he has had for 20 years. It nearly killed him to buy white shirts and a suit for his new job in Euclid. He loved the farm because he could be out in the real air, and he wouldn't wear work gloves because he liked to touch the earth and the wood and the animals. It was painful for him to go to work in an office when we moved. He did not like being sealed up inside with nothing real to touch. We'd had the same car, a blue Chevy, for 15 years. He couldn't bear to part with it because he had touched and repaired every inch of it. I also think that he couldn't bear the thought that if he sold it, someone might take it to the junkyard. My father hated the whole idea of putting cars out to pasture. He often prowled through junkyards touching old cars and buying old alternators and carburetors just for the joy of cleaning them up and making them work again. My grandfather had never quite gotten the hang of car mechanics, and so we thought my father was a genius. My mother was right when she said my father was good. He was always thinking of little things to cheer up someone else. This nearly drove my mother crazy because I think she wanted to keep up with him, but it was not her natural gift like it was with my father. He would be out in the field and see a flowering bush that my grandmother might like, and he would dig the whole thing up and take it straight over to Grandma's garden and replant it. If it snowed, he would be up at dawn and trek over to his parents' house and shovel out their driveway. If he went into town to buy supplies for the farm, he would come back with something for my mother and something for me. They were small things, a cotton scarf, a book, a glass paperweight, but whatever he bought, it was exactly what you would have picked out for yourself. I had never seen him angry. Sometimes I don't think you're human, my mother told him. It was the sort of thing that she said just before she left, and it bothered me because it seemed as if she wanted him to be meaner, less good. 2 days before she left, when I first heard her raise the subject of leaving, she said, "I feel so rotten in comparison." "Sugar, you're not rotten," he said. "See," she said, "see, why couldn't you at least believe I'm rotten?" "Because you're not," he said. She said she had to leave in order to clear her head and to clear her heart of all the bad things. She needed to learn about what she was. "You can do that here, sugar," he said. "I need to do it on my own," she said. "I can't think. All I see here is what I am not. I am not brave. I am not good. And I wish someone would call me by my real name. My real name isn't Sugar. It's Chan Hasten." She had not been well. She had had some terrible shocks, it is true, but I did not understand why she could not get better with us. I begged her to take me with her, but she said I could not miss school and my father needed me, and besides, she had to go alone. She had to. I thought that she might change her mind, or at least tell me when she was leaving, but she did neither of those things. She left me a letter which explained that if she said goodbye, it would be too terribly painful and it would sound too permanent. She wanted me to know that she would think of me every minute and that she would be back before the tulips bloomed. But of course, she was not back before the tulips bloomed. It nearly killed my father after she left. I know it, but he continued on doing everything just as before, whistling and humming and finding little gifts for people. He kept bringing home gifts for my mother and stacking them in a pile in their bedroom. On the day after he found out that she wasn't returning, he flew to Lewiston, Idaho. And when he came back, he spent 3 days chipping away at the fireplace hidden behind the plaster wall. Some of the cement grouting between the bricks had to be replaced, and he wrote her name in the new cement. He wrote Chan Hasten, not Sugar. 3 weeks later, he put the farm up for sale. By this time, he was receiving letters from Mrs. Cadaver, and I knew that he was answering her letters. Then he drove up to see Mrs. Cadaver while I stayed with Graham and Gramps. When he came back, he said that we were moving to Euclid. Mrs. Cadaver had helped him find a job. I didn't even wonder how he had met Mrs. Cadaver or how long he had known her. I ignored her whole existence. Besides, I was too busy throwing the most colossal temper tantrums. I refused to move. I would not leave our farm, our maple tree, our swimming hole, our pigs, our chickens, our hayloft. I would not leave the place that belonged to me. I would not leave the place to which I was convinced my mother might return. At first my father did not argue with me. He let me behave like a wild boar. At last he took down the for sale sign and put up a for rent sign. He said he would rent out the farm, hire someone to care for the animals and the crops, and rent a house for us in Euclid. The farm would still belong to us, and one day we could return to it. But for now, he said, we have to leave because your mother is haunting me day and night. She's in the fields, the air, the barn, the walls, the trees. He said we were making this move to learn about bravery and courage. That sounded awfully familiar. In the end, I think I merely ran out of steam. I stopped throwing tantrums. I didn't help pack, but when the time came, I climbed in the car and joined my father for our move to Euclid. I did not feel brave, and I did not feel courageous. When I told my story of Phoebe to Graham and Gramps, I mentioned none of this. They knew it already. They knew my father was a good man. They knew I did not want to leave the farm. They knew my father felt we had to leave. They also knew that my father had tried many times to explain to me about Margaret, but that I wouldn't hear it. On that long day that my father and I left the farm behind and drove to Euclid, I wished that my father was not such a good man. There would be someone to blame for my mother's leaving. I didn't want to blame her. She was my mother, and she was part of me. Fish in the air. Graham said, where did we leave off with Peavy? What was happening? What's the matter, Gooseberry? Grim said. Did that snake bite your brains? No, she said. It did not bite my brains. I was just trying to refresh my memory. Let's see, Grim said. Then Peavy wants you to tell your daddy about Mrs. Cadaver and Mr. Bookway hacking up her husband? Yes, that is what Phoebe wanted it, and it is what I tried to do. One Sunday, when my father was looking through the photo albums, I asked him if he knew much about Mrs. Cadaver. He looked up quickly. You're ready to talk about Margaret? He said. Well, there were a few things I wanted to mention. I've been waiting to explain, he said. I plunged on. I didn't want him to explain. I wanted to warn him. Phoebe and I saw her slashing and hacking away at the bushes in the backyard. Is there something wrong with that? He asked. I tried another approach. Her voice is like dead leaves blowing around, and her hair is spooky. I see, he said. And there is a man who visits her. Sal. That sounds like spying. And I don't think that we should go over there anymore. Dad took off his glasses and rubbed them on his shirt for about 5 minutes, and then he said, Sal, you're trying to catch fish in the air. Your mother is not coming back. It looked like I was merely jealous of Mrs. Cadaver. There in the calm light of my father, all those things that Phoebe had said about Mrs. Cadaver seemed foolish. I'd like to explain about her, my father said. Oh, never mind. Just forget I mentioned her. I don't need any explanations. Later, when I was doing my homework, I found myself doodling in the margin of my English book. I had drawn a figure of a woman with wild hair and evil eyes and a rope around her neck. I drew a tree, fastened the rope to it, and I hung her. The next day at school, I studied Mr. Bookway as he leaped and cavorted about the classroom. If he was a murderer, he certainly was a lively one. I'd always pictured murderers as being mopey and sullen. I hoped Mr. Bookway was in love with Margaret Cadaver and would marry her and take her away so that my father and I could go back to Bybanks. What I found most surprising about Mr. Bookway was that he increasingly reminded me of my mother, or at least of my mother before the sadness set in. There was a liveliness to both Mr. Bookway and my mother, and an excitement, a passion for words and for stories. That day, as Mr. Bookway talked about Greek mythology, I started daydreaming about my mother, who loved books almost as much as she loved all her outdoor treasures. She liked to carry little books in her pocket. Sometimes when we were out in the fields, We'd flop down in the grass and start reading aloud. My mother especially liked Indian stories. She knew about thunder gods, earth makers, wise crows, sly coyotes, and shadow souls. Her favorite stories were those about people who came back after death as a bird or a river or a horse. She even knew one story about an old warrior who came back as a potato. The next thing I knew, Mr. Brookway was saying, "Right, Phoebe? Are you awake? You have the second report." "Report?" Phoebe said. Mr. Brookway clutched his heart. "Ben is doing an oral report on Prometheus this Friday. You're doing one on Pandora next Monday." "Lucky me," Phoebe muttered. Mr. Brookway asked me to stay after class for a minute. Phoebe sent me a warning message with her eyebrows. As everyone else was leaving the room, Phoebe said, "I'll stay with you if you want." "Why?" "Because of him hacking up Mr. Cadaver. That's what. I don't think you should be alone with him." He did not hack me up. Instead, he gave me a special assignment, a mini journal. "I don't know what that is," I said. Phoebe was breathing on my shoulder. Mr. Brookway said that I should write about something that interested me. "Like what?" I said. "Oh, a place, a room, a person. Don't worry about it too much. Just write whatever comes to mind." Phoebe and I walked home with Mary Lou and Ben. My brain was a mess. What with trying not to flinch whenever Ben brushed against me, when when we left Ben and Mary Lou and turned the corner onto Phoebe Street, I wasn't paying much attention. I suppose that I suppose I was aware that someone was coming along the sidewalk in our direction, but I wasn't until the person was about 3 feet away that I really took notice. It was Phoebe's lunatic coming toward us, staring right at us. He stopped directly in front of us, blocking our way. "Phoebe Winterbottom, right?" he said to Phoebe. Her voice was a little squeak. The only sound that came out was a tiny "erp." "What's the matter?" he said. He slid one hand into his pocket. Phoebe pushed him, yanked my arm, and started running. "Oh my gosh!" she said. "Oh my gosh!" I was grateful that we were nearly at Phoebe's house, so if he stabbed us in broad daylight, maybe one of the neighbors would discover our bodies and take us to the hospital before we bled entirely to death. I was beginning to believe that he was a lunatic. Phoebe tugged at her doorknob, but the door was locked. Phoebe beat on the door, and her mother suddenly pulled it open. She looked rather pale and shaken herself. "It was locked," Phoebe said. "Why was the door locked?" "Oh, sweetie," Mrs. Winterbottom said, "it's just that I thought that—" She peered around us and looked up and down the street. "Did you see someone? Did someone frighten you?" "It was the lunatic," Phoebe said. "We saw him just now." She could hardly catch her breath. Maybe we should call the police or tell Dad." I took a good long look at Phoebe's mother. She did not seem capable of phoning the police or Mr. Winterbottom. I think she was more scared than we were. She went around locking all the doors. Nothing more happened this evening, and by the time I went home, the lunatic did not seem quite so threatening. No one called the police. To my knowledge, Mrs. Winterbottom had not yet told Mr. Winterbottom. But right before I left Phoebe's house, Phoebe said to me, "If I see the lunatic once more, I'll phone the police myself." Question for set 5.